Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Space Text Lab seminar. Today, I'd like to welcome Dr. Martin Fleischmann, who will present his and Professor Dani Arribas-Bel's work on the emergent structure of urban form and function, a data-driven overview of the British landscape. Martin is a member of the Urban and Regional Laboratory at the Charles University in Prague, and a fellow in the Geographic Data Science Lab at the University of Liverpool. He has a PhD in architecture from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow, and his research is interested in urban morphology and geographic data science, focusing on quantitative analysis and classification of urban form, remote sensing, and AI, bringing the architectural aspect of the description of cities to geography and data science. In addition, Martin writes open source software, promotes open science, and helps others with their data as a freelancer. And Dani Arribas-Bel is a professor in geographic data science at the University of Liverpool and deputy program director for urban analytics at the Alan Turing Institute, where he's also an ESRC fellow. He holds honorary positions at the University of Chicago Center for Spatial Data Science and the Center for Open Geographical Science of San Diego State University. Dani's research combines modern computation with new forms of data to shed light on the spatial structure of cities. His research is published in journals such as +1, Demography, Geographic Analysis, or Environmental Planning. And he's also a member of the developmental team of piecemeal, the Python library for spatial analysis. Dani currently serves as co-editor of the journal Environmental Planning B, Urban Analytics and City Science, where he co-founded the Urban Data Code section, and the journal of the Royal Statistical Society Series A, Statistics in Society. And with this, I'd like to hand over to Martin, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting talk about his ongoing work on measuring urban form and function.
Thank you, Kim. Thank you for the nice introductions. Thank you for invitation. I'm happy to see some of familiar names in the audience, so I'm glad to reconnect to some of the people we've been in touch over the past years. I'm going to talk about ideally one of the outcomes of the project, which we have started with Arribas-Bel about 3 years ago already. Within his fellowship at the Alan Turing Institute, most of the work was done at the University of Liverpool back then. And we're going to talk about the emergent structure of urban form and function. So we're going to cover how we conceptualize urban form, how we conceptualize urban function. We're going to talk about the urban grammar, which is the project we worked on, and then we're going to talk about the emergent structure, which is something which surprised us once we did the classification of Great Britain using form function framework and started looking into what we can actually find there. So what do we mean by urban form and function? Why is that important? How we arrange stuff in cities really matters. So we can, I'm speaking to people familiar with space syntax, so I don't have to stress this very much. But even though it matters in academia for us for some time already, it's becoming more and more important even in policy and in practice. And we can start, we see already some policy documents on national or international levels stressing the importance of, let's say, the right urban form or urban form for sustainable development and urban form which makes our cities essentially better. So, and by form, I mean essentially the physical structure. What does it look like? The physical structure and appearance of cities, how we define it in some of our papers. That usually in literature you can find it analyzed from different perspectives. Historically, the urban morphology was kind of going through the qualitative ways, even with some quantitative case studies. Recently, for about last, I don't know, 10 years, there's been a bit of rise in morphometrics, like quantitative description of things, which I will be talking about a bit more. And we also see a lot of work on the remote sensing when it comes to description of urban form, as we can see it from above. On the other hand, function tries to answer what is it used for, what a place is used for generally, and we are trying to talk about activities that take place within a certain environment, focusing primarily on urban environment. And regarding function, there's a lot of happening in literature, and it's not limited to a small field like urban morphology. It tends to be for urban form. And we can see a lot of work happening across different fields, from sociology, environmental science, transportation, economics. And what we are trying to do is to combine the two together. Because we believe that combination of form and function to a degree encodes the past, encodes the history and the development of our cities. And at the same time, it frames the future. Once we create an environment, we are kind of restricted by that environment in what we can do with our lives and with the future development. In the literature, forming function is studied. It's not like that it's completely new topic. We wouldn't try to claim that. And we know that it's being studied being used to study neighborhood effects, agglomerations, environmental sustainability. But all those studies are often coarse. They are on some aggregate level done. They are a bit ad hoc, and they have a lot of limitations. You can certainly find and figure out a lot of limitation yourself. For us, what is really important is the detail. So on these two figures, you can see a 50-minute walk from a certain location in two different types of urban development in Houston. And you can see that it's very, very different depending on, in this case, the structure of street network. And we don't want to lose this kind of information, this detail on the local perception when we zoom out to a classification or to national level studies. That's why we're trying to find, or we are trying to figure out a way of describing environment, and primarily urban, but we're not excluding non-urban environment, in a way which is at the same time detailed. So it means that we are capturing the information on a very granular level. So we still have the notion that this is one building and this is another building. We want it to be scalable, which means that if you're going from a level of a building to the level of the whole country, it needs to run decently. A lot of studies are just impossible to scale to these kind of extents. And we also want it to be consistent. That is slightly tricky part, because the consistency comes with the consistency of data. But I will show you some examples from different places across the world, which do not have necessarily consistent data, but given the consistent methodology and consistent conceptualization of the classification, the result is, let's say, consistent on a level of reasonable interpretation. So the first part we started to do was to look into the part of form and into ways of scaling that, because when we started, I don't think there was any published study that was analyzing urban form on a national scale with a certain level of detail and extensive amount of information captured. because this can actually be quite complicated to do. Traditional schools of urban morphology almost cannot scale because it depends on a lot of interpretation, on a lot of detailed work with either town plans or even plans of individual buildings. So those are very nice bodies of literature, very extensive schools of thought, but it's practically impossible to take those and scale them on a level of a whole country, which was our goal. Space syntax can scale. I mean, we've seen that before. So there's absolutely amazing map of whole Great Britain and measure with the traditional kind of space syntax measurements of integration and choice. But it focuses on a specific subset of the environment, which is primarily the connectivity. We try to go slightly beyond that to include more information on form, on buildings, and their spatial distribution. We also wanted to include function, which obviously integration doesn't necessarily capture directly, while there are some indirect links to that. And while our work is not necessarily built on top of space syntax, there are some similar aspects. One of the stuff we measure in the end, I will talk about it later, but just since I have this slide in here, is local closeness, which is analogous to, I believe, integration in space syntax. We do not measure choice or betweenness because we are trying to avoid linear features in the classification. But there are some similarities in the way that we're trying to measure the configuration. We're trying to measure distributions of spatial features, and we can go back into this in the discussion if you want to. Some of the morphometric approaches are we're starting to find a way how to scale stuff. It was work of Alessandro Araldi, Giovanni Fusco in France, work of Metta Berghaus-Font and Chalmers School in Sweden. Chris Joachim was doing great work down in Southampton, and I was starting to explore this back doing my PhD at Strathclyde. And that kind of forms the basis for the urban grammar project. It's a project that I think is still ongoing under the Alan Turing Institute umbrella. I will be talking about the first part of it only during this talk because it's going in the end towards a bit of more remote sensing with more AI. I will be talking about the first part where we are building the, let's say, baseline classification, which we call spatial signatures. The definition of spatial signatures is fairly simple. It's a characterization of space based on form and function, as I introduced in the beginning, and designed to understand urban environments. I think this last bit is important because there's a lot of classifications of space that are available, that have been available for many years, but they are designed to understand non-urban environments. So a typical example is Corrine land cover classification, which has something like 47 different classes, and you have 4 different types of forests, 7 different types of fields, a couple of different types of waters, and all these natural environments. And then you have 3 or 4 classes of urban environment, saying this is dense urban environment, this is not so dense one, and this is probably industrial zone. Which is it's a cool type of classification, but for our usage of, let's say, urban nerds, architects, urban geographers, it's not super useful because it doesn't give us the the distinction between urban environment we would like to have. And we try to flip this to its head. So instead of having 90% of classes capturing non-urban environment and then 10 capturing urban environment is kind of the rest. We have in the end classes that are primarily focusing on urban environment, and then we have a couple which are capturing non-urban. One of the first things we had to resolve was going to be the spatial unit for this classification. Are we going to use output areas, lower super output areas? Are we going to deploy some grid or hexagonal grid or the British grid, or what are we going to do with this actually? And we came up with something which is called enclosed tessellation or enclosed tessellation cell. And the reason for this is that we wanted to have some spatial unit that is adaptive to specific environment. So if we are in a granular or historical city center, we have small spatial units. If we are out in the countryside, we have large spatial units, and which are conceptually defined exactly the same way. So the enclosed tessellation is based on a set of barriers and building footprints. So we first take street networks, we take streets, railways, coastline, waterways, and we have a mouse. So this is an image of streets, and I think these are railways probably, or maybe water. Not certain about it right now. We cut the area with those barriers into polygons, and then within each of those, we use building footprints to subdivide it further using, let's say, Voronoi tessellation method. So each building gets allocated space which is near the building itself, and this gives us a basis for the work, and it allows us to follow the topology of space when we are trying to understand the context, the neighborhood of every single spatial unit, like in this image. A big important part of what we're doing is not to only describe, let's say, those buildings on streets in specific location, but understand how that differs and how that varies in the immediate context. And that context is not defined as a set buffer of let's say 400 meters, but is defined as topological distance on this mesh of enclosed tessellation, which allows us to compare the same level of information when we are in Barcelona, like in this case, or where we are somewhere in the highlands in north of Scotland. So how the whole process works. We start with the barriers, as I mentioned. We create enclosures, which is the first level of enclosed tessellation. Those are the polygons or areas which are from all sides enclosed by at least one of the boundaries. We include buildings to generate enclosed tessellation as our spatial unit. On this spatial unit, we link all the information we can measure on form and on function. I will get to that a bit later. What exactly are we measuring? Because it depends on the case study. But once we have, let's say, rich information for every single of those enclosed tessellation cells, we use cluster analysis to group them together based on their similarity. And then we have a resulting spatial signatures, the areas which we think are internally homogeneous based on their form and their function. The benefits of this approach are that it's data-driven, completely data-driven. We're not specifying which classes do we want in the end. We're not specifying how many we want. We're not adding any of our ideas into what the result should be, apart from trying to understand what is the optimal number of final classes. We managed to have to make it scalable, so it's not that problematic to run it on the whole country. And we managed to have it granular, so the whole classification is based on a level of individual enclosed tessellation cells, which in the urban environment is nearly equal to individual buildings. And because it's all open source, using open data solely, it's ready to be deployed elsewhere also. And once we did this kind of theoretical background, we started with the test. Wanted to understand how this is going to work in different contexts. We were designing it with an idea of creating the British classification in mind, but we first went abroad. We took 5 different cities from different historical environments, different places around the world, which importantly comes with different data landscapes and different quality of data. So we looked into Barcelona in Spain, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Houston, Medellin, and Singapore. And we tried to do the classification of those cities using the spatial signatures framework. Obviously, it wasn't possible to use exactly the same data everywhere because they're just not available everywhere. With Barcelona, we had amazing open data from their open data portal. In other cases, we had to use OpenStreetMap, like in Singapore. Or in other cases, we had to use satellite-derived building footprints, like in case of Houston, surprisingly, which was the worst regarding the data availability from this sample. Function was measured in a similar way, using open data, using land use, land cover data from either local, national, or global data sets. We're using some global grids on population mapping from World Pop project. We're using the information on night lights from the VIIR satellites and some other information depending on the case study. And every single city was then clustered using k-means algorithm independently. So we were not putting them all into the same bowl because the data was slightly different. And this is the result, which we used to then kind of validate whether the approach we designed is actually valid and whether it makes sense. So the Barcelona is first one. You can probably already see what the spatial signatures are trying to do, that we are having the historical center delineated as one type of urban environment. We have the example as another one, another signature type. We have historical villages that used to be in Barcelona before the infill with example happened. And we're quite pleased with the result. And we managed to validate it up to a degree with some external data, and we looked to other places. Houston is a super interesting case because it had the highest amount of enclosed tessellation cells to deal with. So we're, I think, dealing with something like 2 million enclosed tessellation cells in Houston compared to, in a while, I think something like 100,000 in Barcelona. But nevertheless, even though the number of kind of information to work with was the highest, the number of signature types we found was the lowest. American cities are just boring from this kind of perspective, I would say. On the other hand, the Medellin was super interesting one, because Medellin is a city which is in the valley. So there are steep hills on both sides of Medellin. And we're not noticing that the signature types are sort of capturing the different altitude in the city, which came with different types of development in there. And in some cases, there are some favela-like developments on those steep hills. It was really interesting to see that we can actually capture something like physical geography with information that doesn't have any information, doesn't have any input on the physical geography apart from the build form, which is following somehow the steepness of hills. And we finally did also Singapore and Dar es Salaam. Dar es Salaam was a good case study because there was recently a humanitarian mapping project, and OpenStreetMap contains amazing data set of buildings and streets for Dar es Salaam. So it was really fun to work with. And yeah, so we did our test and we were ready to deploy it on the whole Great Britain because the test proved to be very interesting, at least. So we started developing British signatures. We measured roughly 300 different characters or variables or attributes, how do you want to call it? On form, we measured everything we could based on from dimensions of individual elements of urban form, their shapes, intensities, connectivities, diversities. On the function side, we're measuring auto population data, we were measuring employment data, how many jobs are at which locations. We were measuring accessibility to different amenities. We were measuring the presence of listed buildings or listed areas in certain locations, and a couple of other things. And I don't want to go through all of them in here. All that was coming from open data sources. So we restricted the whole work to use only data that are openly available to anyone. So even though we could have potentially used Ordnance Survey's master map as academicians, we didn't want to because it would restrict anyone else of doing the same stuff. So we were using OS OpenMap, which comes at a cost of a bit of lack of resolution in some cases. And we use open roads to capture form. And then we used open business censuses or standard censuses on function, OpenStreetMap, and some other data sets available either on CDRC website, like the geolytics locations of supermarkets, or listed buildings coming from, I think, historic England and historic Scotland data sets, and some other information coming from satellites like NTVI, coming from Sentinel-2. And here's the result. We managed to combine all this and use a cluster algorithm to come up with classification with 16 different types of urban or non-urban development, which can be roughly divided into 3 groups. We have countryside, which covers wild countryside, as you can see in here, which is north of Scotland mostly, or Wales. We have agriculture, which is covering most of English countryside. And we have something we call urban buffer, which is an area which is near cities or towns, but it's mostly agricultural in nature, but there is a bit more development than what you find in complete agriculture. Then we have 4 types of urban development, which kind of group under the periphery group. And then we have 9 of those, which are primarily urban. And here you can see that flip I was talking about compared to land use land cover before. 9 of 16 classes are very urban, and 13 out of 16 are somehow urban. Here's an example from the Scottish Central Belt, coming from Glasgow to Edinburgh. And these are the classes that we would call non-urban in the countryside. So the light blue one is the urban buffer I was mentioning before. So you can see that it's not necessarily on land within cities, but it's some kind of transition zone from either agriculture or from wild countryside. And we have peripheries, which are very well contained in Edinburgh, but not so much around Glasgow. And then we have the urban types of form. All this is publicly available, and there are papers about the classification. There are data products about the classification. There are maps, and there are websites like this one, which allows you to look into classification, to understand what are the different types, where they are, what do we mean by something like disconnected suburbia, why is that disconnected suburbia, and what's typical for it. And you can understand better the methodology I was mentioning, and download the data, download the code and everything. So what does this classification actually tells us about the British landscape? This was an interesting exercise because we developed a classification, and the next step in the whole project of urban grammar was to develop AI model that would detect this classification from satellite imagery and then ideally deploy it in time so we can get a time series of that. So we started working on that, but at the same time, we were interested in understanding a bit more what the classification shows us and what it can tell us about Britain. So we started with simple statistics. The non-urban countryside classes, which are 3 of those, they cover 94% of area, but only 50% of enclosed tessellation cells of our spatial units. So that we can see that they are probably much larger on average than everything else. So they're covering large amounts of area, but not that large amount of actual units of length. The peripheral types of urban development cover 5% of total area of Great Britain, but they cover 40% of enclosed tessellation cells. So you can say that the 40% of buildings in the country, if we kind of simplify that to the buildings, belong to one of those classes which are on the periphery of urban development. And then the most interesting types in urban development are covering only 1% of the total area, but they are covering 10% of buildings category. We then started to look into their spatial distribution or their co-occurrence, like trying to understand where they are and trying to understand whether there is certain pattern in which type of development neighbors which other type of development. And we came up with a graphics like this, which is not super straightforward to understand. I admit that, but let me walk you through it. Here we have the full map of the signatures in Great Britain, and then every column and every row is a single type of urban signatures. So we have wild countryside agriculture, all the way to dense urban neighborhoods, or some classes we call urbanity, which are the most urban forming usually centers of cities, up to hyper concentrated urbanity class, which is present only in central London. So we can always start looking at the spatial distribution of these, whether they are more on south of the country or north of the country, whether they are more west or east, which is partially interesting. You can start seeing London popping up all the way in here in here, and Scottish Highlands occupying the majority of western part of the country compared to agriculture occupying majority of the eastern part of the country. But important and interesting bit is this one in the middle. We try to encode how big part of the boundary of each signature type is shared with any other type. And there are some interesting patterns starting to popping up. For example, this kind of diagonal bit on the very bottom right. The signatures are roughly sorted from most urban on the bottom right to the least urban on the left and top. We do have updated version of this, where this sorting is done based on the data in the metrics, but the figure wasn't updated yet, unfortunately. But we see that, for example, the hyper-concentrated urbanity, the most city-like development we have seen, has only one neighbor, which is concentrated urbanity. And we see that concentrated urbanity obviously has the hyper-concentrated one, but then it has only one neighbor on the other side, which is metropolitan urbanity. And we started to see a pattern here, which kind of encodes a bit of urban hierarchy. And I'm going to jump to the map of signatures. I'm going to go all the way to London, because that's the best example for this phenomena we can observe in here. You can see already on the map that the different types of this very urban development are distributed in concentric rings. So we have the hyper-concentrated urbanity in the very, very middle, but then every other type forms its own individual ring around the previous one, up until something we call dense urban neighborhoods. And this is not present only in London, but it's present essentially in any other city which has more than one of these very urban classes. So we try to look specifically into this. And we sorted, in this case, functional urban areas based on the global human settlement layer in the Great Britain, according to this hierarchy. You can see, and I hope that the resolution on your side is good enough so you can actually see. I will try to read it for you just to be on the safe side. On the very left side, we have, unsurprisingly, London, which contains all of the hyper-concentrated urbanity. It contains all of the concentrated urbanity. It contains a lot of metropolitan urbanity. But there we can see that a range of other cities are on the, let's say, one level of urban hierarchy below London. And those are cities like Birmingham, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Manchester, all the way up to Leicester, Newcastle, Brighton. We can call these kind of like a tier 2 after London, which is a tier 1 because it has all of them. These have metropolitan urbanity as tier 2. But no other functional urban area across the country has any of those. Then we can go to regional urbanity, which can be called like a tier 3, where we have places like Liverpool, Aberdeen, and Norwich and Swansea. And then we can go another step further to places where their top level, the most urban signature type is local urbanity. And that would be York, that would be Ayr, that would be Carlisle or Lancaster. And we can go on these kind of steps all the way down to dense residential neighborhoods, dense urban neighborhoods, and grid residential neighborhoods. And we can see that according to this specific graph. The least urban of functional urban areas in Great Britain is Telford, which I have to admit I don't know where it is. And we can turn this classification into a bit more diagrammatic schema, and you can see that we represent different signature types and their area as kind of a dishes in here, with London being very specific in this context, but we can sort already those different types into concentrated urbanities, which is London, metropolitan region, local, and dense urban neighborhoods. The final part we looked into was to understand, out of those very many form and function characters we are measuring, which are actually important for every single of these classes. And there's also interesting pattern in here, because we can see again on x-axis we have sorted signature types from the least urban to the most urban, and we see that with the least urban, most of the least urban classes, function is not important. It's like it's form what is driving the signatures, the form what is making them distinct from any other. But when you get to the urban classes, function, which is encoded as yellow, starts to popping up. And while it never reaches the highest importance for any class, it becomes more important in urban environment and in city center-like urban environment than it was in any other of them. As I mentioned, the whole work is kind of open by default. So we work using only open source software, and we write open source software, and we contribute some of the advancement we did here into existing open source packages. We use open source data and open data and release open data in the end of that. And we did the whole work in a kind of a transparent way on GitHub. So as we were coding, as we were figuring out stuff, new Jupyter notebooks were popping up on our GitHub repositories, and you were able to follow that, and you are still able to follow that, and you are able to follow the blog posts we have around every single step we do in here. And I think very fresh news is that the classification will become available or also within Carto platform. I don't remember how it's called. I think Carto Data Observatory very soon. More information is on the website urbangrammar.ai.xyz. Couple of lessons we learned from this work. One of them is that spatial signatures are able to encode geography, like we've seen in the case of Medellin and their steep hills. It's able to encode history, as we've seen in Barcelona, and nicely capturing different phases of development of this city. And it's able to capture different changes in technology. Like in Houston, we are able to, and generally in American cities, we are able to distinguish areas which were built where the tram lines were there, and distinguish them from those which were built where the car was dominating the city. And on the case of Great Britain, we see that spatial signatures can capture the hierarchy of cities within the whole network of cities across the whole country. So to wrap this up, because I'm already a bit late compared to my plans, urban form and function underpin many social processes. And we are currently in the phase where both form and function are becoming much easier to measure, and much easier to measure it better with much more detail based on much nicer data. And we believe that we and you should use urban form and function and ideal spatial signatures, if you like those, in your work and in our work to help pushing the pushing the science of cities into next phases, and hoping that we will be able to kind of standardize some ways and simplify some complex processes that happens in cities into classifications like signatures or any other. And that's all for me, and I'm happy to take any questions you may have, hopefully, and thank you.